Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the online learning component of AP Psychology for your first week. I had such a wonderful time getting to know all of you in class last week, and I'm excited to dive a little bit further into what psychology is and specifically how history, perspectives, and major subfields of psychology influence the field today. So, without further ado, want to make sure that you have your interactive notebooks open and set up so that we can take a peek at Learning Target 1C through Learning Target 1E today. So you want to just double check where you are in that interactive learning notebook. If you remember, we did a brief preview of Learning Targets 1A and 1B together, and you took a look at that. Hopefully you did before diving into this video so that we can continue on today looking at 1C and 1E. So make sure you know right where you are in that interactive notebook, and we will go ahead and get started with the fun. So first up, we're going to describe and compare some different theoretical approaches in explaining behavior. Last time in class, we talked about how sometimes people do things and we think to ourselves, why in the world are you behaving in that particular way? And the idea behind our current eclectic approach in psychology is that there's lots of different theoretical approaches that all might give a different explanation for the behavior that we're seeing. We're going to start out by talking about three historical schools of thought. And I like to think of these as waves of thought. Each wave is a way of thinking about human thought and behavior that really dominated the field of psychology for a particular period of time until a new way of looking at psychology kind of rolled in and took its place. So we're going to start out by looking specifically at structuralism, functionalism, and Gestalt psychology this morning. Now, structuralism is an early psychological perspective that really emphasized units of consciousness and identification of different mental elements of thought using a method called introspection. So, Wilhelm Wundt from Germany, he's considered to be the founder of this particular field. And Wundt was really interested in trying to break down the whole of the mind, the brain, into its basic units and parts, its structures, if you will, to see how those different structures working together might influence human thought, emotion, and behavior. And the way that he tried to scientifically study this is through a method called introspection. Introspection is where he would ask participants just to literally introspect, to think inward and tell him about what they thought the basic structures of their brain were. So introspection is kind of considered to be the first attempt at scientific psychology, yet it's not overly scientific because it really did rely pretty heavily on individuals' kind of biased thoughts about what was going on in their thoughts and emotions and behavior according to those mind structures. So Wundt is considered to be the founder of scientific psychology in Germany. Another major player, in structuralism is Stanley Hall. And Stanley Hall is famous for bringing introspection to his lab at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, so from Germany now into the US, and he's also the first president of the American Psychological Association. A couple of other famous structuralists to keep in mind. Edward Titchener also studied elements of consciousness, those structures of consciousness, hence structuralism, at his Cornell University lab. And Margaret Floy Washburn was actually the first female structuralist to complete her PhD in psychology. Go, Margaret. So that's structuralism. Next wave of thought is functionalism. So functionalism is another very early psychological perspective concerned with how organisms like us or even animals use their perceptual abilities to adapt to their environment. So structuralism is all about the basic structures of the brain. Functionalism is really concerned with how do we use what we've got to adapt and best fit the environment that we're in. So William James is a famous functionalist. He actually wrote the first psychology textbook called Principles of Psychology. So that's his famous contribution. And another famous structuralist, Mary Whiton Calkins, you actually saw her name on the Psychology Hall of Fame back in 1.B. She is credited with being the first woman president of the American Psychological Association. All right, so we're going to take a quick pause in the action here. And in your interactive notebook, I have a brief article for you to check out, Structuralism and Functionalism, Schools of Thought. So go ahead and click that open, take a couple minutes to read through it. It's a very brief read. And then once you're finished with the article, go ahead and fill out this comparison chart here. This is going to be a really useful study tool for you. It's going to ask you to think about the strengths and influence of structuralism versus functionalism. And then there are also some criticisms of each particular approach to psychology, and you'll be able to list those there as well. And this activity is really just going to help us be critical consumers of these two particular approaches. So go ahead and pause the video, complete that activity, and then resume when you're done. All right, our next kind of old school approach that influences our current approach is Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology refers to form or organization of consciousness rather than the content, rather than the individual parts of perception and behavior. So Gestalt psychologists are famous for coining the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, so for instance, this is a little bit abstract, you guys, and we're going to get into this in more detail in a future chapter. So right now, we're just kind of laying the foundation. And I would say for right now, for your general understanding, just have a sense that Gestalt psychologists really promote this idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So for instance, if you're looking at the image in front of you, think to yourself about what you see in that image. Some of you might see a black triangle in the background with a white triangle in that negative space there. Some of you might see some little Pac-Man looking things. Or if you have no idea what that is, because I'm so much older than you, some circles with a little pie slice taken out of them there. That's us seeing the whole as greater than the sum of its parts. None of us looked at the paper, at the image there and said, oh, I just see a bunch of black lines and some partially enclosed circles or something like that. So just kind of think about the whole is greater than the sum of its parts when we come to Gestalt. Okay, in order to kind of make this abstract Gestalt approach a little bit more tangible for you, again, we're going to take a pause and do an interactive notebook activity. So what I would love for you to do is read this really brief article. It gives you a Gestalt overview. And again, you're going to list here for yourself the history, the criticisms, the influence, and how the image below that you can see in your interactive notebook, it's not listed on the slide here, how that reflects Gestalt principles. All right, so again, we're going to take a pause, complete that activity in your notebook, and then go ahead and resume the video when you're done. All right, so we just looked at three old school approaches to psychology: structuralism, functionalism, and Gestalt. Now we get to turn our attention to what, in my opinion, is the good stuff. All right, so we're going to look at some approaches to psychology, and they range on a spectrum from nature to nurture. Okay, now nature versus nurture is an enduring issue in the field of psychology. And at its essence, nature versus nurture basically means how much of the behavior that you exhibit as a human being is due to nature or your genetic makeup, what you've inherited from your parents, or nurture, what you've learned from the environment around you. So for instance, intelligence. Lots of people like to argue nature versus nurture when it comes to intelligence. You're born with, well, are you? You're either born or you learn, and eventually we measure your intelligence in society by giving you an IQ, an intelligence quotient. Some people think that your IQ is completely a function of nature or what you've inherited from your parents. And if your IQ is similar to that of your parents, you might adopt the nature point of view. The nurture point of view would say your IQ has nothing to do with what your parents have given you genetically, but rather based on the best schools that you've gone to and the amount of work that you've put in to learn and grow your intelligence quotient. So that's the idea behind nature versus nurture. And when we look at pretty much any human trait or behavior, you could make a solid argument for nature versus nurture influencing any particular trait or behavior out there. A lot of research has been done on nature versus nurture. And so there are certain traits where we know that nature more heavily influences than nurture and vice versa. So more to come on that, but just wanted to explain why these psychological approaches exist on a spectrum, the way that you see here. All right, so very briefly, because then we'll do a deeper dive into each of these approaches to psychology. We have the biological approach to psychology, which explains human thought, emotion, and behavior according to our genetic inheritance and our biological makeup. So, for instance, perhaps you know someone who's struggling with depression or an overabundance of negative thoughts, and that's kind of negatively impacting their life. Someone looking at that issue from the biological approach would focus on genetic inheritance. Do other people in your friend's family struggle with depression? And so perhaps it was passed on genetically. Or is there some sort of chemical imbalance going on in the brain that we might be able to fix with some psychotropic drugs? That's the biological approach. The psychoanalysis approach is very fascinating and it stems from Freud, and it's pretty abstract, but the idea is that we're driven by these innate urges for sex and aggression that we eventually, because we live in a respectable society, have to learn to control. Okay. And according to psychoanalysts, a lot of times when we shove down those natural urges that we have and we don't address them or process through them, they come out and influence our behavior in a particular way. Psychoanalysts would also put heavy influence on anything that's happened to you during childhood. And so, for instance, again, if we look at someone struggling with depression, a psychoanalyst, rather than talking about genes or chemical imbalances the way that the biologists would, psychoanalysts would say, I wonder if something interesting or upsetting happened to you during your childhood, and that is actually subconsciously influencing the depressive feelings that you're having at the current time. So biological approach, psychoanalysis. Our next approach is cognitive psychology. And cognitive psychologists are really interested in the way that we think and organize information, and the content of the thoughts that we tell ourselves, how that might influence any particular issue that we're having in our life. So again, if you have someone who's prone to depression, perhaps they're regularly telling themselves negative thoughts like, I'm not good enough, I'm so worthless, I don't have any friends. Those are some pretty typical thoughts that people with depression tell themselves on a regular basis. And so cognitive psychologists are very interested in our thinking and the way that our thinking influences our emotions and behaviors. Humanism, we're going to learn a little bit more about humanism a little later on in this particular lecture, but they're all about how humans seek to satisfy first their basic needs and eventually their needs to have a fulfilling, meaningful life. And so we'll look at that as well. And then behaviorism is very, very far over on the nurture side. Behaviorists believe that all behavior is learned from the environment through conditioning. And we'll talk a little bit more about behaviorism in a moment. Okay, these modern approaches to psychology, again, we don't want to necessarily think of them as completely discrete from one another. And we don't want to think that just one approach is always going to tell us all of the information that we need to help somebody work through particular thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And so you'll often hear the term biopsychological approach when we talk about these perspectives, these approaches to explaining thought, emotion, and behavior. So biological influences would include all of the things we talked about when we looked at the biological approach itself: genetics, brain mechanisms, hormonal influences, anything physiological. We also have all of these psychological influences on particular thoughts, emotions, and behavior. So, approaches that would fall under psychological influences would be the behavioral approach, the humanistic approach, the cognitive approach. And then we also have these social cultural influences. So, in addition to these biological and learned psychological influences on our thoughts, emotions, and behavior, we also live within a culture, right, with other people. And so, psychologists acknowledge, and we're going to look at a whole chapter on this social psychology, that there are lots of different social and cultural influences that also influence people's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. All right, so here's a summary slide for you to revisit on your own time, but just wanted to kind of give you a brief summary of the major psychological perspectives in the field. All right, so we're going to take a pause now because we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these really prominent approaches that we're going to continue to revisit multiple times throughout the year so that we can understand them a little bit better. And hopefully this is where things are going to get really interesting for you. And I encourage you as much as possible as we work through this section to make as many connections between these approaches and your own personal life as you can, because I think the beautiful, powerful thing about psychology is that once we understand these approaches, we can actually use what we know about them to change our own thoughts, emotions, and behavior in ways that benefit our lives. All right, so we're going to take another look at the behavioral approach to psychology. But before we do, I want you to pause the video and work through these items. In the middle column there, want you to describe an example of a behavior that you want to increase and what specific steps you can take to increase that behavior. Maybe you want to eat more vegetables, or maybe you want to exercise more. So write the behavior, but then also write some tangible steps that you might take to achieve that behavior. Okay. Next, you're gonna on the right-hand column, you're gonna describe an example of a behavior that you want to decrease and what steps you can take to decrease that behavior. Maybe you want to procrastinate a little bit less. And so you can think about that as well. And then over on that left-hand column, I encourage you at some point this week, observe someone in your family, even for 3 minutes, and write down 5 observable behaviors that you notice in your family. Maybe you're having a conversation with a parent and your mom rolls her eyes at you. Oh, dang. Or maybe you see your dad frantically writing some notes on a piece of paper at the table. Whatever it is, write down just a basic description of those behaviors and try not to add any of your own meaning into it, but just capture the behavior. All right, so I'm excited to see what you put in those boxes. Go ahead and pause and do that, and then resume the video when you're done. All right, so let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into behaviorism. Basically, behaviorists explain thoughts and behavior in terms of conditioning. Conditioning is a fancy word for either using reward or punishment to reinforce a behavior. Okay? The idea is that if we do a behavior and we receive a reward for it, we're going to increase that behavior. We're going to do it more. If we do a behavior and we receive a punishment for it, we are going to likely decrease that behavior and do it less. And this applies equally, honestly, you guys, to pets and human beings. So maybe you can think about a pet that you have at home, and maybe you want to teach the pet to sit, right? So the way that you can condition your pet to sit is every single time that it sits, you're going to reward it either with some kind words or a treat or some pats, whatever floats your pet's boat. But the idea is that if it sits and you reward it, it's increasing the likelihood that your pet is going to sit on command again because it wants to receive that reward, and it starts to realize the connection between the behavior and the consequence. Maybe you want to decrease your pet's behavior of going to the bathroom indoors. And so in the case that your pet does go to the bathroom indoors, perhaps there might be a mild punishment that you would give that pet to decrease the likelihood that your pet would do that particular thing. We as people actually condition each other all the times to do all types of crazy things. And so we'll talk more about this in the learning chapter. But for now, just want to lay that foundation for you. Okay, some key people in the field. And right now, we're just going to document these people in your interactive notebook. Again, we're going to do a deeper dive into this perspective in another chapter. The reason we look at it here is because it just lays the foundation. It gives you a general idea so that you can make a connection to previous knowledge once we do a deeper dive later. Okay, so key behaviorists are Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. Now, the behavioral approach tells us a lot about why we see particular behaviors happening, but one major criticism of the approach is that it underestimates the complexity of human behavior. It really only focuses on rewards and punishments, and we know that people are motivated to do various behaviors for lots of reasons outside just whether they're being rewarded or punished. All right, psychoanalytic perspective, a little bit of a deeper dive here. So like we mentioned earlier, the idea behind the psychoanalytic perspective is that we have this part of our mind called the unconscious. And here, to kind of illustrate this, we'll use the example of an iceberg. You can see on your screen there, there's this unconscious mind, according to Freud. Only a little part of our conscious understanding is actually within our awareness. And there's all this other stuff, in his opinion, going on below the surface of the water, like an iceberg, that you can't really see and tap into exactly, but it's influencing you in various ways. And so Freud's idea is that, again, any of those negative urges that we have, we mentally shove into our unconscious. Anything horrible that's happened to us in our childhood or upsetting or things like that, we shove into our unconscious, and it's in there and it's affecting us, but we don't even realize that it's affecting us. And so according to Freud, then, if we want to make the unknown known, we have to somehow probe into it, tap into it. And that's what psychoanalysis is all about. Again, we'll do a deeper dive into this in a later chapter as well, but just laying kind of the basic foundation for you here. Some key players would be Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Okay, some criticisms of the psychoanalytic psychodynamic theory are that it definitely overemphasizes the influence of aggression and sexuality, and it underemphasizes the role of social relationships or other things happening in the world that would influence behavior. Psychoanalysis is absolutely not scientific whatsoever because there's no way that you can measure the unconscious. We don't even know if it exists. It's unobservable, and scientific psychology really does focus on observable behaviors and traits. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pause the video here. We're going to look at the humanistic approach in just a moment, but before we do, just want to invite you to think about a couple of questions. These are very humanistic questions, and you're going to put the answers here in your interactive notebook. So first question, when you think about the good life, the things in life that are really going to make your life feel meaningful to you, what does that look like? Jot down a brief description of that. Maybe you're married, maybe you have kids, maybe you don't have kids, maybe you're not married. What does your career look like? Basically, what do you think a meaningful life is for you? Okay. And actually, sorry, that's going to be the question on the right-hand side in that column there. On the left-hand side, you can just think about yourself now. What makes life worth living for you now? So go ahead and reflect on that in your notebook, pause the video, and then you can start the video again when you're done. So humanists are all about focusing on the positive in life, focusing on our strengths and figuring out how they can help human beings self-actualize. And so the idea underneath humanism is that we have these basic needs as human beings, and as we're able to get those needs met as a result of living in the world, our ultimate need is to self-actualize. We want as human beings to understand what our purpose is and figure out ways in which we can actually do that to meet our own potential. And so we'll talk about that more as we move forward as well. Okay, some key humanists are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And a major criticism of this approach is that because of this focus on the person and their personal experiences and subjective perception of the world, humanists kind of like they regard the scientific methods as inappropriate for studying behavior. And yet in psychology, we're all about the scientific method. And so there's a little bit of a fight going on between the humanists and scientific psychologists. All right, just a few more things here, my friends. We are making it together. Let's go ahead and pause the notebook before we look at the cognitive approach. Now, the cognitive approach is all about the thoughts that we tell ourselves that influence the way that we perceive the world. So what I would love for you to do right now, a lot of us don't even realize that we do this, but we're constantly talking to ourselves throughout the day. We're telling ourselves things that help us make sense of our experience. And a lot of times automatic thoughts pop into our head that may or may not be true, but that definitely influence our behavior. So I want you to think about one negative thought about yourself that popped into your head today. And you don't even have to tell me what it is. If you want to put it there, you definitely can, save space. But think about one negative thought that you thought about yourself today. And as you reflect on that thought, answer the following questions. Now that you're out of that thought, how accurate do you think that thought actually was? And if it wasn't super accurate, how might you reframe that thought to inspire positive action moving forward? So for instance, maybe you got something wrong on a homework assignment. A negative automatic thought that might pop into your head is, oh my gosh, I'm so dumb. Well, if we really think about that, that's probably not a really accurate thought. And if we allow ourselves to live in that reality, we're not going to feel very good. And so a positive reframe of that particular thought might be, you know what? I just struggled on this one particular item. I'm going to do better next time. That makes us feel a lot better. So go ahead and pause the video and do that activity, and then resume the video when you're done. All right, so again, the cognitive approach, it really interprets behavior in terms of the automatic thoughts that we tell ourselves, how we interpret what's going on in the world around us, and what we tell ourselves mentally about those particular things. Some criticisms of the cognitive approach are that thoughts obviously are not directly observable. We can't see them. And so we have to rely on the people who are having those thoughts to tell us all about them. And so it's a little bit less scientific than something you could actually observe with your eye. And again, it also ignores other reasons for behavior except for thoughts. Okay, some key cognitivists are Ebbinghaus and Loftus. And so you can put those names down for yourself too. All right. And then we've got the sociocultural approach. This is my personal favorite approach because I think it's so interesting to think about the ways in which the culture that we are growing up within influences our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So the sociocultural approach tells us that parents, caregivers, peers, and the culture at large are responsible for developing our higher order functions, that our development really relies on social interactions with other people. And so it can differ heavily based on the culture that you're growing up in. And so some key socioculturalists are Vygotsky in particular. And you're probably noticing a trend in criticisms at this point, because basically no one approach can ever explain everything that we need to know about human thought, emotion, and behavior. And so that, again, is a key criticism of the sociocultural approach. It ignores other important factors. It's why we take an eclectic approach. We are almost there, my friends. The biological approach, also called neuroscience, this has to do with the ways in which genes and brain chemistry and hormones and other physiological factors in the body influence thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Lots of biological psychologists have concentrated on abnormal behavior and have tried to explain it. So, for example, biological psychologists believe that schizophrenia, a psychological disorder, is affected by levels of dopamine in your brain, a neurotransmitter. Some criticisms, again, of this approach is that it kind of ignores environmental differences or thoughts and how those might influence behavior. We also have the evolutionary approach, and this examines thoughts and behaviors in terms of natural selection. And the idea is that we have adapted over time some traits that have micro-evolved that help us best adapt into our current society. And the idea behind the evolutionary approach, if we look at microevolution again, is that the behaviors that exist in society today are the ones that helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce. And so they continue to be present in the gene pool. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in our biopsychology chapter. The major player related to the evolutionary approach is Darwin, and a major criticism of this approach is that it fails to account for consciousness and the influence of the environment on behavior. All right, so we're going to press pause here, and we're going to go through an example that helps us actually apply what the different approaches have to say to an actual real world situation, just to kind of make this a little bit more tangible for you. And thank you for hanging in there today. I know that it's a lot of theory and some of it's kind of abstract. I promise we're laying the foundation for so many more really interesting applications to your life as a human in the world. All right. So for the next examples, go ahead and fill in the responses in your notebook. Okay. So thinking about a behavior like test anxiety, what might psychoanalysts say about test anxiety? Well, they might say the test anxiety serves as a release valve for any sort of negative things that are festering in your unconscious. That's how the psychoanalysts would explain an observable behavior like test anxiety. Behaviorists might say that test anxiety is learned by observing siblings who also experienced nervousness in testing situations or through reinforcements and punishments. And before I show you humanistic, what do you think humanists might say about why test anxiety exists? Just think about that for a second. Humanists might say that test anxiety results when our esteem needs aren't met and we don't have confidence in our ability to be successful. Cognitivists would say that our thoughts, the things that we're telling ourselves about the ability to take the test, are going to result in test anxiety. So we would want to adapt those thoughts. Biologists would simply say that we have some sort of neurotransmitter imbalance going on that we would want to address. Evolutionary psychologists would say, you know what? Anxiety has actually helped us adapt to our environment and survive because people who are really vigilant are going to guard themselves against danger and be more likely to be successful in living in the world. And the sociocultural approach would say individuals from culture that place value on success and school achievement are more likely to experience anxiety because success and school achievement are valued by society. So then we feel all of this pressure on ourselves to achieve at those levels. And so you can see how if we look at the same exact behavior, these approaches would all tell us something a little bit different about why that behavior is existing. And depending on the behavior that we're looking at, some make a lot more sense than others, but we always want to take an eclectic approach. Okay, so next learning target is recognizing the strengths and limitations of applying theories to explain behavior. And again, we just kind of talked about this. An approach is a perspective that always involves certain assumptions about human behavior. And most psychologists would agree that no one perspective is correct. Every single perspective we've talked about today has its own strengths and weaknesses and brings something different to the table when we're trying to understand human thought, emotion, and behavior. And so again, that's why psychologists today take an eclectic approach to explaining thought, emotion, and behavior. Okay, and then our last learning target for our online section this week is to distinguish between the different domains of psychology. And here we're going to look specifically at the difference between basic research and applied research. Those are considered to be the two major domains of psychology. And within that, we see some different approaches. So we've got the biological approach, the cognitive approach, and the developmental approach here listed under basic research. the educational approach, the experimental approach, and the testing and measurement approach under basic research. Personality and social. Applied research is different from basic research in that applied researchers, they actually take information and apply it to real life settings. And so applied researchers are often practitioners, whereas the basic research components that we just looked at, those psychologists are really just doing research to broaden our knowledge field. Okay, so basic research broadens our knowledge field in those areas that we just looked at. Applied researchers then take that information and they focus on how people can use it to benefit human beings. Okay, so we have clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, and human factors psychologists under the applied umbrella. We also have industrial organizational, school psychologists, positive psychologists, and psychiatrists. And that kind of sums up our initial purview into the field of psychology in terms of those historical perspectives, current perspectives, and ways in which we can explain human thought, emotion, and behavior. Thank you for hanging in there. Again, this was probably one of our more theoretical, abstract learnings together, and I promise you stick with it because a lot of what we do in the future then is going to be taking these foundations and diving into more practical applications of those. All right, so friendly reminder for you, your interactive notebook notes for 1C, D, and E are going to be due at the very beginning of class next time. Your reading guide, the printed out reading guide, is also going to be completed and due at the beginning of class next time, and we will be having a vocab quiz when I see you again, and I'm really looking forward to it. Have a wonderful week.